before the mic, when you present, just take one of these up there.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Thank you.
Hi, nice to meet you, Parker. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank
Your
you.
one that was it like Arcadia?
Yeah.
That one?
So if we
Thank
both
you
have our
so
scripts
much.
up there,
And just, should I just like Los Angeles or what are you
Yeah, yeah.
thinking-
Thank you so much.
how big is it?
We can
We can just honestly.
at the podium.
Oh yeah. You're doing it. Squish this. Oh, so we can.
Which way?
Yeah.
That way?
Oh. Cause yeah, I think we're in order sort of.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh wow, we're large. I can just, do you want me to turn like that?
Are we good?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're good. So I It's in the correct order also. Yeah, sorry. I think
It's okay.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alex Bizarski. We are going to be starting our fourth panel. Okay. So our next panel is called Me, Myself, and AI, and our first presenter is Barker Thompson from the Polytechnic School.
Hi, I'm Barker. I'm a junior at or Polytechnic School, and I'm going to be reading 3 pieces of creative writing that I wrote this year. And the first one, they all explore my own identity, but in 3 very different ways. The first is through exploring structure in poetry, specifically through an acrostic poem or mnemonic, whatever you want to call it, and specifically functioning as a plea for queer men in specific to embrace themselves through like personal liberation. And so I hope you enjoy this first one, and I'll be giving little intros to everyone, so I'll take a little pause after. Mnemonic for gay boys. Lose. L. Lift your shirt up on its hinges and kiss your tummy. It has been growling for centuries, and it is about time to do right by this body of yours. O. Over green hills, roll down with a lover to get grass stains on blue capris, and walk barefoot to a laundromat or Rome. Fall in love so you can swim in purple detergent or the Tiber. S. Slip a handwritten note under his apartment door that says, I would like to feel how I feel with you forever, I think, in your prettiest cursive, and I swear he will unlock your heart before a door could ever. E. Even if this life fails you, know that you swam upriver in currents that could strip you of everything you were or wanted to be, and that is something to smile about. It. I. In between the twilight tears you pour, there is a glisten that I promise has a handhold or two. T. Tame your mind, sweet tiger, you are strong enough to break this elusive cage. All. A. And remember where you cannot reach is reachable. L. Let no one peel you apart, you are not stuck to anything, you are the riptide on a glowing nightmare. L. Listen to each pump of your heart, and soon you will taste it all like a smothered pretty past life that is now you, the boy. So yeah, now on to my next one. So this is a much different type of piece. Again, pretty experimental. So I took a creative nonfiction class, which is what Miss Hamilton, who moderated the second panel, taught. And we went for our kind of like a final assignment or experience. We went to the LA Public Library, the Central Library, where they had an exhibit on different collections and what, like the power in collecting things. And one of the collections that they featured there was it was called Gay Bar Matches, and it was a person. It wasn't even an artist. It was an artist who collected these collections, but this person had collected matchboxes from gay bars that all around the country, specifically most of them from the 1950s. And so anyway, so how this ties into myself is that I wrote a very, very short story about putting myself in the shoes of someone going to one of those gay bars in the 50s, in my experience, if I was to be that person. So this is Stale Lovers. Stale Lovers. It's 1954. I have a bottle of my own spit on my bedside table. Lubricant is expensive at the drugstore, and the cashier is my mom's ex. I wake up next to strangers beside me who were beautiful the night before. I swear by it. It's pathetic, really. I'm naked, save for a striped sock. I've grown a mustache overnight, and I stroke it as I mouth the word masculinity, feel its syllables. I feel full in the way that nothing is full, and maybe it'll always be that way. Beside me, he's 20 or 25 or 39 or 52, and I'm whatever I want to be. I'm Marlon Brando, I'm James Stewart. Hell, I'm Marilyn, Grace Kelly. I call myself something in between, like innocence, like deviance, but not quite. We exist because we can, and we can because we exist. Boots, the big banana, meat rack, Dude City, the den. I kick him out at 10 a.m. He climbs into his Continental or a taxi cab or his wife waiting at the curb. It's September, it's January, but I don't really care, so don't remind me. And then my last one is, again, an assignment for my creative nonfiction class. And this was a really fun assignment. Basically, we kind of started the project by reading Rebecca Solnit's A Field Guide to Getting Lost, which was an amazing piece. Well, it's a book, but we read a chapter from it, which was basically about the value of getting lost, specifically in a figurative and literal sense, and how when you lose yourself, no matter what it may be, you really find yourself, and kind of like what that means, and what that means for everyone. So then the actual assignment was to literally get lost in the world around you, and discover things about yourself or the world around you by getting lost. And so to do that, I again wanted to start with the literal, like getting lost, and then find meaning within that and see how I discovered myself and the people around me. So I asked my dad to blindfold me and drive me anywhere that I'd never been before. And then I would get out and walk around and get lost. And so this is the product. He drove me to Arcadia, which I don't know if anyone has been there. It's like east of Pasadena where I go to school. It's not a lot there. But so, I mean, there's some gems, but it's anyway. So this is Arcadia blindfolded. Again, this is a poem. 1, KIA, kicking it awesome. I climb into the brand new Kia that my dad bought, almost like God told him to, or he was held at gunpoint. The point is, it has cloth seats that I like, and it sings a song when you turn the ignition off. My dad named her Esther. To most people, it is Kia, a Korean car company, relatively cheap vehicles, a flashy storefront on brand in Glendale. To my dad, it is KIA, an acronym for kicking it awesome. Don't ask why, it is better that way. Dad, I want you to blindfold me and drive me someplace I have never been, your choice, and drop me off and let me get lost, okay? 2, Arboretum. The last time I walked blindfolded was 4th grade, pin the tail on the donkey. I want to open my eyes, trusting someone will kill me, I am sure of it. I hear a waterfall, know a river, damn it, you know this place. I clutch Dad's calluses. For the first time in my life, I am not leading the way. It is nice to be the guided, not the guide. I climb down steps, forgetting how to walk down steps. I make suggestions with my feet or with whatever these things are that are attached to my ankles. Have you ever felt like you could be nowhere but anywhere at the same time? Blindfold comes off, and it is not a memory. Welcome to the Los Angeles County Arboretum. 3, Pedestrian. Noun. A person walking along a road or in a developed area. It is now Baldwin Avenue, but 5 hours ago, it was parking lot getaway. Take 2 hedge flowers off a strip mall bush, and you are Queen of Hawaii for 20 minutes or a lifetime. It is now Baldwin Avenue, but 5 hours ago, it was Railroad Cottage with a railroad. Kiss the concrete and thank the gold rush. Throw a penny for a 49er or two, and dance the polka as the train to Eureka or Arcadia rolls by. It is now Baldwin Avenue, but 5 hours ago, it was a handful of glimpses. The Santa Anita racetrack. Lo and behold, the only thing the San Gabriel Valley has to offer east of the Paseo, where I like to go to cry my eyes out, in the thongs at Victoria's Secret, or in Cold Stone's waffle cones. I wish I could be a racehorse. It sure would be nice to be bet on. 4. January pumpkins. I see a sign next to spikes on the ground. Stop. Do not enter. Severe tire damage will occur. I turn onto this street. A car zooms by. There is nothing nicer in this world than a paved sidewalk. I live in a sidewalkless neighborhood. Old couples wear bright neon reflective vests at night when they walk their rescues because people go 35 on our street. And my dad screams, "Slow down," with waving arms as loud as he can. But the man is playing Kanye. There are 4 things that make me incredibly sad or incredibly happy on my walk down somewhere next to the Santa Anita racetrack. Number 1. One house has a bench next to their front door with 4 pumpkins sitting on them, like they're posing for a family picture. It is January. Maybe they forgot about Halloween. Promises melting like Snickers bars. Number 2. 2 men pull out of a driveway across the street. The man in the passenger seat has a lollipop in his mouth, or maybe it's a popsicle. I hate myself for wondering if they are high school dropouts. But a Tootsie Pop, Monday, 3:45 p.m. Am I jumping to conclusions? I want to meet their wives and say that I'm sorry. I am so, so sorry. And hand her a ring pop to make it up to her. Number 3. I find out that I have been walking down a street called Hugo Reed Drive that intersects with Golden West Avenue. Wikipedia says Hugo Reed was an early resident of Los Angeles County who became a naturalized citizen of California and who married a local Gabrielino woman. So I decided it's fitting that he intersects with the Golden West. This intersection a tribute of sorts, I suppose. Number 4. I call my dad. I'm done getting lost, Dad. Can you come pick me up? As I wait for the Kicking It Awesome, a woman walks by. She is pushing a stroller, there is a baby inside, and I regret not asking her what she plans to do with her life on Hugo Reed Drive. I am not judging, but on Sundays, will you take your baby to bet on horses? Woman, you have to promise me that you will crown yourself Queen of Hawaii, or at least drive over the spikes before you die, so that severe tire damage will occur. I promise I will dig your grave in the arboretum if I can find my way back to where I started.
And next from Granada Hills High School, we have Sarah Tran and Rachel Park.
Thank you. Do you want to scoot that way a little? No, because oh, okay.
So hi everyone. My name is Rachel Park,
And my name is Sarah Tran.
and we are juniors from Granada Hills Charter High School. And today we will be redefining identity through M Butterfly by David Henry Wayne. Okay. Hey Sarah. Sarah.
What do you want now? Can't you see that I'm busy?
Well, I've had this question on my mind. What do you think your identity is?
Isn't it obvious? I'm a tech fanatic. I'm a Silicon Valley.
But is that really your identity?
Hold up. We often hear this infamous question of who are you? Now that I think about it, I don't really have any answer. Sure, I am a tech wizard. Woo!
But we are so much more than just our identity. We are so much more than how the online world perceives us to be. In fact, it is worth exploring why we present ourselves in a certain filter and these implications. Or should I say, implications?
So today, we are going to take a pause to first examine the foundations of where we base our lives upon, the identities we take upon, and how this shapes our futures.
Many people feel pressured to conform to societal expectations.
That reminds me of a piece of literature I've listened to from an audiobook, the transcript of the play M. Butterfly by playwright David Henry Hwang.
Oh yeah, I remember that play. Isn't that the one where the Frenchman, René Gallimard, falls in love with Song Li-ling, but Song is actually a male Chinese spy sent to acquire information from Gallimard about the Vietnam War. Gallimard attempts to understand his world and his life by referring to a play called Madame Butterfly by Giacomo Puccini.
Specifically, Gallimard tries to be the main character, Pinkerton. Pinkerton embodies all of the characteristics of the modern-day misogyny and stereotypically macho traits. He is tall, tough, and insensitive.
As a parody of the original, Hwang plays upon this intertextuality between M. Butterfly and Madame Butterfly in order to reinforce the notion that people base their lives on unrealistic expectations.
We can apply the intertextuality of M. Butterfly and its implications to our usage of technology, namely to our dissatisfaction with ourselves and an indifferent viewpoint on the world. This dissatisfaction stems from the conflict of coming to terms and not feeling content with one's identity.
We can see Gallimard's frustration with his identity in how he describes Pinkerton. He states, "While we men may all want to kick Pinkerton, very few of us would pass up the opportunity to be Pinkerton." Gallimard admits that Pinkerton is a bad role model. However, because of Pinkerton's archetypal manly characteristics, he understands how most men would want to be like him.
In the online world, we see celebrities who are not exactly role models per se or champions of moral virtue. However, because they receive glory, popularity, and fame, we are led to believe that if we want to receive that same attention, we have to be like them. This establishes a precedent the online world has in our lives to dictate who we ought to be like. Much like how Gallimard views another text to determine how he should act, we use tech to grasp who we should be.
Therefore, we see that the characteristics of intertextuality parallel those of intertechnologicality. The characteristics of intertextuality describes the way in which similar or related texts relate, differ, and influence each other. Intertechnologicality, then, describes the way in which similar or related technological platforms affect one another.
In this situation, we see that Hwang parodies the original opera, Madame Butterfly, through the character of Gallimard, who worships Pinkerton as an omnipotent entity.
He states, "Life's not worth living unless he can win the hearts of the fairest maidens, then hoffa it off the premises ASAP." In the preceding scene, I played Pinkerton, the womanizing cat, and my friend Mark from school played Sharpless, the sensitive soul of reason. In life, however, our positions were always reversed.
Gallimard mentions that he played Pinkerton, the womanizing cat, instead of Sharpless, the sensitive soul of reason. He knows that he is nothing like Pinkerton. Still, he tries to be like Pinkerton's beliefs and embody his character.
Pinkerton is the protagonist of the original opera Madame Butterfly, and Gallimard models after this main character and uses this unrealistic text to determine his own text. And this illustrates a strange paradox that Gallimard faces: to conform to what society calls as masculine, or to accept his own identity.
This is similar to how we try to be perfect. We remodel our Instagram feeds, hold ourselves back from taking a photo unless it is quote-unquote golden hour, and apply filters on filters. Anything to have a flawless identity molded by our identities.
However, James Lowen, in his book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, argues that perfection is not what we should strive for. We live in a society where role models are heroified, so much to the point where their stature is impossible to achieve and their flaws overlooked. This results in an in an inability to actually learn from these role models because they seem so distant.
In our technologically driven society, there are hardly days where we aren't exposed to the media. When we look to the media, we see public figures who are romanticized and glorified, much like how Gallimard sees Pinkerton. Some commonly glorified figures include people who fit the feminine, skinny, and tall woman ideal, or masculine, buff, 6'5" men.
These ideals often frame our perspectives on who we should try to be like. We, like Gallimard, create a false identity for ourselves in an attempt to live up to unrealistic expectations. We do this by 1, selectively crafting the image we choose to portray online, and 2, in the figures that we choose to embody. As a result, we suppress what society labels as phases and views as not the norm.
We attempt to present ourselves in a way that we think will appease other people, because it seems as if other people's acceptance will determine our own happiness. After all, Gallimard states, happiness is so rare that our mind can turn somersaults to protect it. Our inability to accept ourselves for who we are, out of fear of condemnation, causes us to live in a constant state of discontent, disillusionment, and conflict.
We use social media as a platform to configure ourselves into a quote-unquote perfect being. The intertextuality between Huang's M. Butterfly and Puccini's Madame Butterfly parallels the effects of intertechnologicality. We attempt to embody the ideal society presents us with, and it tells us that if we hope to achieve fame, power, and ultimately acceptance, this is exactly what we should do.
Lowen cautions us on how we present ourselves via our online identity. In other words, if everyone is perfect, how can we fix the flaws of our society? Thank you.
Next, we have Nicholas Trill from Loyola.
Hello, my name is Nicholas Turrell, a senior at Loyola, and today I will be presenting on William Blake and how I related the birth of his articulated mythology to a modern understanding of the dynamic unconscious. The title of my paper is Material Opposition to the Divine Human Will in Blake's Mythology, and in it I take a look at 2 of his own Genesis stories, the Book of Urizen and the Book of Los, paying close attention to how the 2 Eternals, Urizen and Los, manifest as symbolic representations of 2 distinct and opposed faculties within the mind, ironclad reason and unbridled imagination. So for those of you who aren't familiar with William Blake, he is an 18th century poet who often used his work as an artistic device for political commentary, molding his poetry into varying narrative forms to detail his often eccentric opinions. From the verses themselves to the elaborate engravings from the original plates, his work surely deserves a place on the mantle of countercultural masterpieces. But he also transcended the field of political criticism as he transitioned in the second half of his career with the goal of conceiving for himself a completely redesigned myth, proposed as an alternative to the pathological quest for knowledge that is often associated with 18th and 19th century Europe. The Book of Urizen and the Book of Los provide 2 separate accounts of the fall of the Eternals into the material world of the observable and measurable, which torments the primal unity of Blake's eternal family. Out of this fall, the first man is created and subsequently is divided among the ages to form a population. However, accompanying this natural proliferation of a species comes too, in Blake's mind, the terrible reality of increasingly conflicted impulses within the human psyche. One whose goal is to describe and reduce, and the other whose goal is to expand and create. He immortalizes this sense of apprehension, accomplishing his prophetic goal through a complex reassignment of biblical imagery, archetypal symbols, and human nature, conceiving his 2 Genesis stories as he establishes the main conflict of his myth and his understanding of an intensely intrinsic conflict within the human will. This conflict applies at both the individual level, with the juxtaposition of rational and imaginative propensities within the human will, and at the collective level, in relation to the contrast between the dominant trend of Enlightenment-style reason and Blake's poetic genius. Blake, in his own words, held that the poetic genius is the true man, and the body or outward form of man is derived from the poetic genius. Likewise, the forms of all things are derived from their genius, which by the ancients was called an angel and spirit and demon. Hence, as Blake boldly accepts the call of his godlike Eternals to unravel their dark visions of torment, he establishes himself as a prophet of countercultural formation, affirming the impulse to express his inner poetic genius, and establishing his own mythological system of swift-winged words in which the poet attempts to liberate the spiritual self through the faculty of their romantic imagination. Sir Isaac Newton, the vanguard of scientific improvement during the Enlightenment, developed the system of Newtonian mechanics, which demonstrated the fact that a modern science was able to predict and manipulate the forces of nature in a way that was previously unimaginable. After this discovery, nevertheless, Newton drew back further into his dogmatic devotion to a biblical, totalitarian God, one that governs all things and who is Lord over all. However, this tyrannical rule of a God proliferated through institutional dogma was not a comparable understanding of divinity with that of Blake's belief in the divine prowess of the human will. This, coupled with Newton's destabilizing conclusions that supported materialism and further separated man from divine selfhood, prompted Blake to scathingly critique Newton's findings, both the literal conclusions of the physicist and his ironic continued dedication to a dogmatic tradition. Although the conflict in Blake's myth is to reestablish this connection between the divine and the self through the imaginative faculty, it must be dealt with in a separated state from eternity, as Urizen and Los fall from their position of immortality into this discernible and measurable material world. Urizen, the eternal of reason, causes this fall, and consequently forces Los, the eternal of imagination, to fall as well, for the two are bound together in eternity. Accordingly, a ferocity is born between them, as each celestial figure restricts the other's impulses. However, the two God figures are quickly organized into Blake's own romantic binary of good and evil. As Urizen unfolds his darkness into a book of brass written in solitude, went to the wrong slide, my bad. As the disturbed Eternals pronounce death, Urizen is a clod of clay. They signal that his abrupt departure signifies his ignorant devotion to material reality over eternal being. But once fallen in this void, this abyss of darkness, Urizen quickly dictates his own laws of materialism, placing them into a book, and deciding to live a life of pathological order and dogmatic devotion. As Urizen unfolds his darkness into a book of eternal brass written in solitude, Blake integrates the nihilistic darkness of Urizen's rational philosophy into the structure of a religious text, and then associates both concepts with a stark materialism of eternal brass. However, the infinite nature of this brass is evidently no longer of capital importance. As Aaron Gross posits, after this moment, the word eternal appears as adjective only, describing creations and suns as once, but implicitly no longer eternal. Urizen's archetypal significance as an emblem of Newtonian-style reason, his fall into materialism, and his subsequent creation of a text structurally similar to biblical dogma, all amalgamate to Blake's overarching critique of human nature. The fault for the break between eternity and the newly created world lies not simply with Urizen, but also with an impetuous surge towards scientific discovery, an impulse that serves to separate man from divinity through the over-reliance on the rational mind. In this dependence on the human intellect, Urizen, along with the generalized condition of the Enlightenment man, from Blake's perspective, loses the ability to perceive outside of the restricting five senses. That is, man loses the ability to imagine when culturally driven to act purely logically. As Daniel Majdiak and Brian Wilkie assert, the Book of Urizen and the Book of Los are a psychology, an attempt to describe the sources of the civil war that afflicts man's psyche. And this civil war is one that is fought between inherently incompatible instincts that underlie conscious expression. Thus, while eternity is separated from the perceptible world of Urizen, Los must mediate between their Eternals and Urizen in their civil war. Although Los comes into being as a metalworker with a hammer and blueprint for Urizen's human illusion, Los's ability to construct Urizen's body comes from the unbridled energy of imagination. facilitated by Los's expanding clear senses, and representative of a mystical ability to perceive reality and to perceive the remaining divine potential of this newly birthed human selfhood. To accomplish this, Los must utilize the pure metaphysical power of his limitless imagination and Blakean poetic genius as he struggles for vent, hurls apart, and stamps furies to dust, restricting and binding Urizen's dark power in chains, using his hammer of imaginative power. Within the fallen condition of the human race, the state of eternity is lost. However, Blake's god of imagination, Los, suggests a lingering possibility for humankind to regain a state of eternal being. To mediate between the observed desire for logical progression within the human psyche, opposed to its divine, unified origins in eternity, Los remains in the void between fire and fire. For his manifestation in the material world of Urizen binds him as well to this stark reality, and the eternal prophet is forced to painfully witness the slow disintegration of his archetypal mythological importance. In Blake's view, dogmatic tradition and scientific reasoning went hand in hand, in that both hampered our gift of consciousness, idolized reductionist reasoning, and categorically subverted our divine ability to imagine. In that sense, the unity Jung would speak about 100 years later is the same primal unity of Blake's original man, formed from the collision of these absolute manifestations of thoroughly conflicting impulses. The imaginative impulse Los maintains, accordingly, can be read as a final connection to the divine, and although the devastating material reality Urizen falls into represents the antithesis to Blake's Eden, Los, the fallen form of timeless imagination, embodies the aspirational potential left in the human race to return to the Eternal's original state of pure metaphysical being. Imagination, in turn, is both Blake's muse and his only remaining hope for futurity. Our imaginations, our lofty consciousness, may provide us with this semi-divine ability to achieve eternal being, but our material impulses and obsession with reductive scientific progress lead the self down a path of alienation, in that the technological advances of our ever-progressing society invariably affect the way our imaginative prowess presents itself to the inflated rational faculty of the mind. But if we can, as Jung suggests, recognize our descent from a higher unity, then maybe there remains hope for the divine selfhood of humanity, not through the institutionalized totalitarian dogma of a hegemonic church, but through the infinite perceptive ability of our souls, the imagination. Thank you.
And now from Flint Ridge, we have Leon Kuo.
Hi, I'm Leon Kuo from Flint Ridge Prep. I'm a sophomore this year, and today I'll be talking to you about the intersections between AI, or artificial intelligence, and literature, humanity, and culture. Last year at the Lit An conference here at Archer, I read my narrative entitled Halfway about my experience being trapped between American and Taiwanese culture. Through various experiences, I gradually gained a greater appreciation and contentment of my bicultural identity that allows me to help others by translating. As I became more at ease in accepting who I am, I took on more tasks translating for friends and family. I translated applications for middle schoolers, takeout menus for my classmates, and also screenshots of text messages. This year, my job description as resident translator grew as I became part of Prep's project Robot Frost, a blend of literature, technology, and visual arts. Our Robot Frost project began when Mr. Bradley, our photography director, and Dr. O'Brien, my 9th grade English teacher, reached out to me about Xiao Ice. Xiao Ice is a Chinese AI by Microsoft that writes poems based on a submitted image. The teachers wanted to use this brand new software to create a project that brought together the 9th grade English and photography students. The photography students' photos were handed out anonymously to the English students, In class, they had just completed a unit on poetry with a section devoted to how famous poets throughout time had responded to visuals such as paintings and photographs. The students were asked to write responses to the images they received. The image would also be fed into Xiao Ice, who wrote her own original poems based on the same photos. After inputting the images into Xiao Ice for interpretation, I translated each of the poems from Chinese to English. I wanted to stay true to the shortcomings of the AI in the Chinese text, so I decided to keep the odd phrasing and flow, but smooth over grammatical errors for better readability. Xiao Ice made many grammatical mistakes, such as using an adjective improperly, and in some instances did not have any logical flow from one verse to another. The complexity of the Chinese language makes it difficult to mimic by a robot, but can also be more forgiving as well. Sometimes the same word is written the same way as a noun, adjective, and a verb. An example coming to mind is 骄傲, which means pride. I had to make many judgment calls on translating the literary phrases, but it was an interesting process nonetheless as I learned more. One of my favorite expressions that I learned was 滔滔不绝, which means to talk fluently and endlessly like the current of a river. On the right are two examples of the poems that Xiao Ice made. As you can see on the first poem, the verses are generally pretty well written, but in the second stanza especially, the verses do not logically follow each other. The lake is turned into a green leaf immediately turns to drawing life's train of thought with passion without any correlation. And in the second poem, the last stanza is already pretty strange in nature, with horses toppling and sweet algae in the dark evening. In this example, the word rather is placed where it does not belong, an error that I eliminated in my final translation. Now let's take a look at the student work for these same images. So for the first image, a tree filled with hundreds of shades of dark purple and violet, powerfully overshadowing its main source of nutrients. And for the second, find someone that will star in your psychodramas and dance in the fire set aflame by your fluorescent sagas. Isn't that something? As you can see, our student writers use powerful imagery and phrasing to convey their ideas, using capitalization to emphasize concepts. They bring their own experiences and mood to their writing, in contrast to the AI's plain composition. If you're interested in seeing more poetry and want to do a test of your own, please check out our station in the back and we'll have more. After the students composed their poetry in the classroom, I began my part of the project over winter break. On my flight to Taiwan, I began inputting the poems into Xiao Ice, which Microsoft hosts on a Chinese website. With my headphones in, I began translating verse after verse of Xiao Ice's poetry while looking at a Chinese-English dictionary. After the first few poems, my mom and I set up an editorial process in which I would translate the poem myself using the dictionary first and would highlight parts that were hard to understand or did not make sense for her to review. Growing up in San Gabriel Valley with a plethora of Asian immigrants, my two cultures are reflected in the people and places around me. There's a certain indescribable comfort that I feel when I see the Chinese characters of various restaurants mixed in with the traditional American chain stores, a similar feeling that I felt seeing my English and Chinese worlds coming together for this project. At the end of the project, we gathered in Prep's Black Box Theater to view the poems and images side by side. When we all came together, I was there in front of 50 students, being a functional part of an exchange of disciplines and cultures. Although the poems were written by a robot, the pictures, student compositions, and the collaboration between all of us was purely human. I think it's quite beautiful that an AI robot that is completely incapable of emotion was able to rally together the unlikely team of 2 departments, a student body, and a mother-son duo to undergo this project. Before I continue, I want to give some background on Alan Turing and the Turing test. Alan Turing was an English scientist, philosopher, and the father of artificial intelligence. His Turing test effectively measures how distinguishable a machine is from a human. The standard version of the test is conducted by an interrogator that communicates with a human and an AI bot using written interactions and must determine which one is human. During our presentation, we completed our own Turing test. In other words, we tested how human this machine really is, as measured by its ability to write and compose poetry and express emotion through its composition. The project led to some very interesting conclusions as we compared Xiao Ai's poems next to the 9th grade students. Although the 9th graders are still learning the art of poetry, we all agreed that Xiao Ai still fell short of being able to mimic a thoughtful human being. Although some of the poems were well written, we concluded that the AI's lack of emotion, cohesiveness, and fluidity made its poetic interpretation fall short, and that it tended to be both confusingly abstract and overly literal, a direct reminder of its humanity, of its lack of humanity. For example, some of the poems wrote about bodies of water when the image was a supermarket, while other poems simply described the color green when the image was a plant, failing to develop its ideas beyond surface-level image recognition. For all these reasons, creative composition still remains in the hands of human writers. In our end, our project raises the question, what is it to be human? And what is the world around us as expressed by the human lens? Poetry as a medium to gauge humanity is so powerful because it is a distilled version of raw human emotion. Each word carries deep power that the writer uses to paint intense ideas that resonate with the reader, something that AI is far from doing. Poetry is something that cannot be written by an algorithm because it does not follow a clear pattern that paperwork or reports do. In all of its forms, poetry always draws on the things that are uniquely human: memories, the human experience, and nostalgia. Moving on from Xiao Ai's for now, I'd like to do a small poll. Please raise your hand if you've ever felt limited from communicating with someone because of a language barrier. That's all of us, right? Now, I'd like you to raise your hand again if Google Translate was sufficient in facilitating that conversation. LA is a perfect example of this phenomenon. As human beings, we do not like uncomfortable situations. We gravitate towards those who speak our first language. With this behavior, we limit our worldview greatly as culture, language, and opinion all intersect with language. In the same way that there are different news sources that we seek that align with our point on the political spectrum, our social circles influence how we see the world around us. Among us, there is a disconnect, and segregation occurs purely based on language. AI holds the power to accurate simultaneous translation that can facilitate our interactions with each other. If we can forge stronger connections to the people around us, I am confident that we will create a more prosperous society. If AI can create a safer world with greater understanding, rather than a lonelier one where we've become even more socially isolated, I feel like the risks just might be worth it. Thank you.
Lastly, we have Emma Wenberg from Polytechnic.
Hi, my name is Emma, and I'm from Poly. First, just big thanks to Grace Hamilton, my creative writing teacher, and the person who schlepped us all out here today. So thank you so much. So this was an essay that I wrote about the neighborhood where I live, Bungalow Heaven, and it was inspired by a piece that we read in class where the author, in typical writer fashion, says that they don't want to talk about their hometown, but then proceeds to write 10 pages about their hometown. And so that was sort of where I got the inspiration for the structure of it. And as I've been moving through my senior year, I've been really nostalgic and thinking about the connection between where you live and your identity. And so how moving away is almost like losing a part of your identity, or attacks on where you live feels like an attack on the self. And so, yeah, that was sort of what I thought about when writing this piece. And first, I just want to clarify that the place where I live, Bungalow Heaven, is super nice. It's a very nice place, and all the feelings that I've had about it are only because I go to a place like Poly where so many people live in these insane neighborhoods. And so all the feelings that might come through are super relative to both Pasadena and just Poly as a whole. So, disclaimer. Okay. I don't want to talk about bungalow heaven. I'd rather not describe Holliston Avenue, its dying camphor trees. One by one, the city comes for them, pulling their trunks from the grass before some apparent fungus can finish its job and create a hazard in the event of Santa Ana winds. The fungus spared the palm trees, though, so soon we'll have no shade, just fronds littering the driveways when God is bored. I don't want to talk about the feeling of being woken up in the morning to shouts from down the block. My street has 2 group homes, a preschool, and a separate tornado of a household. There's one man, Andrew, who claps without rhythm throughout the day. His 6 a.m. shift is my alarm clock. There's another man who stands at the curb each morning, waiting for passerby. He shouts as I drive by on my way to school, and I wave. He puts up a hand and smiles. I wish I didn't have to mention the sidewalk, torn up from roots and a true hazard when you're 7 and trick-or-treating and the street lamps just aren't bright enough. I got used to pushing myself up from the pavement and picking asphalt out of my palms, sweeping up candy from the floor back into my plastic pumpkin. Before any of us knew what a mortgage was, we understood the duality of our neighborhood. We didn't even know what to call it or why it was so bad, but Halloween meant profiling my neighborhood in search of the best candy. Yes to the bungalows with a green front lawn and porch chairs. No to the bungalows with a beware of dog sign or a duplex. Sometimes we were right, often we were wrong. One time we expected a king-size Reese's or Snickers from a nice bungalow, a covered porch with furniture and all, but we just got kid-sized comic books on a boy who died on Halloween, but was lucky because he had already found God, and so we should too. I was traumatized for days. Most days, the 16-block neighborhood looks like a beautiful, almost provincial corner of suburban Los Angeles. Kids ride tricycles over bumpy sidewalks, and a thin layer of smoke hangs near the power lines on summer evenings when all the barbecues are hard at work. I didn't recognize the way some classmates viewed Bungalow Heaven and its neighboring streets until recently, when a kid in my class did a project on North Pasadena. He showed pictures of the area, flicking through slides of a grocery store I saw turn from George's Market to a short-lived community co-op, a house on Bell with a yellowing lawn where I usually give up my goal of an afternoon run and start walking. Look at all this poverty, he says. Private school kids don't understand that there's something between the San Marino homes of the 1% and poverty. That there's a space where McDonald meets Mountain Avenue and where my next door neighbor stacks potted plant on top of potted plant on her small brick porch. In that space, it's a couch where my mom shares tea with a girl from the group home that shares our back fence after she was raped in the park where I learned to ride my bike. That place never felt quite the same again. I only want to talk about lazy summer afternoons, lying in the grass of my front lawn, standing on top of our swing once I had outgrown its blue plastic seat. Stills flash through my mind of walks up the long block to Washington and the Rite Aid with the thrifty ice cream, dancing in the sprinklers that send a wave of water back and forth up into the air. Riding razor scooters up and down Holliston, seeing how far I could coast down the hill, the oak trees growing more and more disparate, finally hitting Orange Grove, which is to say the 4-lane road I wasn't allowed to cross. And so I trekked back, forcefully propelling myself up the incline. I wake up each morning to sun coming through my screen windows, brightening the Meyer lemon tree outside, once an aspirational source of income before I even had a piggy bank. It was an involved affair, collecting the fruits in brown paper Trader Joe's bags, lugging them back into the kitchen, followed by what felt like hours of juicing, the yellow carcasses piling up on the countertops. Armed with 2 or 3 pitchers, I would drag a table and chairs out to the sidewalk and set up shop for the afternoon. I was lucky if I even got 1 or 2 customers, thus we'd have enough lemonade to last a month. Now we just send the lemons to my grandmother, and she sends back limoncello. I slowly stopped hanging out in Bungalow Heaven, no longer going on long walks around the park or to Roscoe's. Friends stopped coming up lake, hikes to the park or Rite Aid were no longer fun. I don't know the sidewalks as well as I used to, and the tires on my bike have been flat for years. As I prepare to leave this chapter of my life in the part of our collective memory associated with school bells or curfews, I found myself saying small goodbyes. To the Meyer lemon tree outside my window, Roma Market, the way the light falls between the oaks at dusk, or the parrots on the telephone lines. What I'm trying to say is that places are complicated, and we find disappointment in the things we love the most. What I'm trying to say, friends, is that I will always love Bungalow Heaven, forever clutching these images close to my proverbial chest. Thank you.
So now we have our panel. I wanted to start off if any of the audience has a question.
As AI does become more human and it becomes sometimes more difficult to tell whether you're talking to a robot or a person, is this something that you're worried about at all? And do you think steps need to be taken to address that, like deception online or maybe even real life later on?
I think AI is definitely becoming something that can be very dangerous if we don't control it. This past year, we saw that Amazon scrapped their employment AI because it was misogynistic. And we also saw, there was also an Uber self-driving car that is powered by AI that killed a pedestrian a few months ago. And so I think AI has the power to help many different sectors of our lives, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we can use it to our advantage and not have it turn on us. Just to have safeguards in place for that.
Does anyone? Okay.
So this question is for Nick and Leon. So when AI is able to develop to that point where it's able to almost replicate the human condition of creativity and maybe even write poetry that's considered objectively better or even superhuman, would that still be able to define or count categorically as literature? Or Nick, like you said, is the whole point of literature, the whole point of creative expression, that there's something divine about the will and about the imaginative side of our psyches? Do you think that's what defines literature, or is the thing that's so beautiful about literature itself is that it expresses like the imperfections of the human condition?
I can take it. Yeah, thank you. I think that Leon touched on this really well in terms of what my paper looked at in Blake's mythology, was that AI will progress to a point where it will be indistinguishable from human intellect, and that's just a fact of computer progression. If you look at it 50 years ago, we had barely the start of video games, and now we have virtual reality, all of that. I think in 100 years, there's no doubt that we will have sophisticated enough AI to mimic rational decisions of humans. What I think is different about humanity or our psyche, or what separates us, I guess you could say, from other animals or in general just computers, is that remaining ability to imagine, to use the poetic genius, if you're using Blake's terminology, to discern something that is abstract, that is of archetypal significance. I don't think that computers have that ability, because it's something that is separate in my, from my perspective, from the intellect. I think there is. I think Blake was right on when he said that there is a very strict divide between that and something else. We could talk about the soul, or just in general our ability to imagine.
Yeah, I really couldn't have said it any better than he just did. I'd say there's something really beautiful in being able to convey your own ideas to another person through the written word. And I think AI has a lot of great applications in the business world with reports and pieces of writing that are just more used for business. But I think that composition will always stay in the hands of human writers, because it's the retelling of the human experience. Yeah.
Hi, this question's for Emma. So Emma, I actually lived in Bungalow Heaven for 12 years and just moved to Kegel Canyon last year, and I teach here at Archer. And I'm curious, one of the things that I always thought was really fascinating about that neighborhood is it's the dichotomy of the poor and the wealth at the same time. So for example, when we went to buy a house last year, there was no way we could afford a house there, even though you'd have other houses next to you that had like the group homes and that had the yellow lawn. So I'm curious if you've seen a change in the neighborhood, and how do you think that speaks to the larger LA reality, I guess, of real estate and families who have been somewhere a long time versus families that are just coming in and changes?
Yeah, I think that's definitely at play. Pasadena is really interesting because north of the 210 freeway, you have areas that were historically redlined, and so now you're seeing lots of gentrification of places like Washington Boulevard, which historically was either Armenian or Latino or largely black areas, and so that's changing. And I think Bungalow Heaven is interesting because it's, on one hand, it's a historical district. There are a lot of old craftsman houses, and so there are all these like architecture tours. But then on the other hand, you have like just near like a few blocks away, you have much like poorer neighborhoods. And so, yeah, I think it definitely sort of speaks to a larger LA realities of changing areas and gentrification. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future. And so, yeah, I think it definitely is a microcosm and also a reflection of, the housing crisis and all the changes that are happening in the city as a whole.
For the people who wrote poems and creative nonfiction, I was wondering if when you're talking about your own identity, are you writing for the self or are you writing for an audience? And if so, if you're writing for an audience, how do you think the way that people perceive your writing impacts how you write it in the first place?
That's a good question. Usually when I write, it's because usually it doesn't start as me writing for someone else or me writing for myself. I write because my mind is constantly coming up with things, and I have a very active imagination and this sounds cliche, but literally it's like a way to channel some of my thoughts. And so that's, I guess, the first thing. And then usually I write in second person. I don't know. I use an ambiguous you, and I have figured that out, that wasn't something I've intentionally done. So I think that I enjoy, and maybe I was influenced by other writers, but I think that it's really interesting to not pinpoint one specific person you're trying to address, but rather broaden the scope of your topic, and how basically every topic that affects one person affects everyone else in a way that can, and it's really interesting how diction and syntax can play a role in that.
Yeah, and I have a really hard time writing about myself. I find myself doing a lot of ekphrastic poetry, which is poetry that's based on visual art. So sort of trying to put myself in a painting or a sculpture or something like that, because it's easier for me than writing about myself. And I think that the question of audience is really interesting because it definitely changes how I write. And I think it actually sort of relates to their presentation on sort of the you that you present to other people and perfectionism. Because writing, especially poetry and creative nonfiction, is supposed to be this deeply authentic thing. And so I find myself falling into this trap of wanting people to think I'm cool through my writing, which might not actually be the most authentic presentation of myself. And so that's been something that I'm trying to undo and work through in my own writing.
Are there any other questions?
So this question was formed in reaction to Leon's presentation, but I guess any of you can answer if you want to. Leon, you mentioned the language barriers between humans and other humans, and then you also mentioned how you basically define like a human as someone who's able to express themselves in a way that is like meaningful and moving in terms of like emotion. I'm just wondering if there are like language barriers, and it seems like sometimes we exclude people who speak a different language, and we think that they cannot express themselves meaningfully because of that language barrier. How there's like a difference between that language barrier and perhaps the language barrier between me and the computer sitting right over there, and then also how perhaps maybe we like the way that things interact with us is different, but can like form consciousness. Like in a way that like like the way that like things express themselves may be their own way of like their own way of like expressing their consciousness to us that we just might not be listening to or experiencing in a certain way.
So I watched a movie recently that kind of relates to your question. It's called Wandering Earth. It's a movie made by a Chinese producer, and they have these headsets in the movie that allow people of all nations to communicate with each other because of simultaneous translation, and they're working to save humanity together. And I think if in terms of the language barrier in our own communities, it's limiting us from not only understanding but collaborating with each other. I think there's a lot of different areas of our community that would improve if we had better communication with each other and better understanding of each other. And even touching on racism, I feel like if we can facilitate this communication across different cultures, it would help with all of our worldviews. And in terms of the difference between that and the barrier between human and machine communication, I think that like the difference is key. Like the main difference is that there's emotion in play with human beings, and there's no emotion with the AI as we see. And I think that like AI will be able to imitate emotion, but I don't think it'll ever be able to convey its own emotion.
We can take one more. I think the question for Nicholas, I was really fascinated by your explanation of Blake as fundamentally trying to transcend like the sort of moral coil of the kind of fallen nature of humanity to this sort of divine act of like creative genius through poetry, and how that was presented in opposition to like Newton's more mechanistic understanding of the universe. My question was just, I'm honestly really curious how Blake related to the sort of Hermetic traditions that came before it during the Renaissance, that people like Newton and like Cartesian dualism was born out of, right? The idea that we could use, we talked about how the poetic genius is fundamentally about our ability to abstract things. How is that not the same thing that Newton is doing when he's trying to abstract the laws of nature through empirical observation? And how does that relate to what's the difference between can rationalism and scientific investigation not also be creative? And how do you draw the line between those?
Mm-hmm. So I think in your question, you kind of answered it from my perspective, that Newton's discoveries were from the use of empirical modes. So he used his five senses to describe the universe and then subsequently reduce it to this measurable entity, which before, the universe was considered to be expansive or like a mystery. And so it removed that using, observation, scientific method, empiricism. I think that the difference between creative expression and literature or poetry is that it comes not from any of the five senses necessarily. When you go deep into your own psyche and, bring to life an idea and then bring it out to a fully articulated final piece, whether it's a piece of poetry, a movie, a novel, I think that that comes from a sense that maybe we haven't defined yet, or isn't necessarily, an empirical sense. You don't see it physically. And so it comes from something that is separate, in my opinion. I don't know if that answered your question. Sorry.
Okay, thank you all for listening to this panel. Thank you, panelists, as well. We will now be breaking for lunch. There is plenty for all guests that are here today, and the next panel will begin at 12:55. Thank you.